Today's case is incredibly sad for so many reasons. But before we get started, welcome to True Crime with Maneater. If you love all things true crime, including missing person cases, cold cases, and just the strange happenings of the world, you've come to the right place. Be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss a video upload. Let's get started. On November 28, 1994, 6-year-old Rikki Neave was living in Peterborough, United Kingdom with his mother Ruth and his siblings. Apparently, his mother Ruth had a very obvious drug addiction, and unfortunately, she was quite terrible to her children. That's quite an understatement. Her kids were often neglected, beaten, starved, and forced to buy her drugs. Ruth Neave was an unfit mother from the beginning, and Ruth would often take out her anger and aggression on her 6-year-old son, Rikki. She once locked him out of the house in nothing but pajamas, and neighbors could hear him screaming. In another incident, apparently in front of police officers, she grabbed Rikki around his neck until he was red in the face. Ruth allegedly held Rikki over a bridge as he screamed in terror. She once forced Rikki up against a wall and forced liquid dish soap into the boy's mouth, and she just continued to squeeze it until he began to choke. She would also write idiot on the little boy's head and wouldn't allow him to wash it off. And apparently social services had come that day and noted that idiot was on this little boy's head. Eventually, Cambridgeshire Social Services would get to know Rikki quite well. He was known to them as a vulnerable child. And although social services was involved with this family, nothing changed for Rikki and his siblings. And multiple times, Ruth threatened to kill her son, Rikki, but still, nothing was being done. Apparently, Ruth did deal speed in order to quote-unquote feed her children. I assume she actually dealt drugs so that she could just buy more drugs. On November 28th, 1994, 6-year-old Rikki would get up, have breakfast, and head to school. But Rikki would never return home. Rikki also never attended school that day. He left home and he vanished. Ruth Neave wouldn't file a missing persons case until around 6 p.m. that night. And then apparently while family and friends and neighbors gathered to look for Rikki, Ruth decided to stay home. And of course, police began to look at her as a suspect. What mother has a missing son and then just stays at home while people are desperately searching for him? The next day, on November 29th, 1994, a little after 12, Rikki's body was discovered. He was found in the woods, stripped completely naked, and posed in a star shape. The autopsy would later reveal that Rikki had been strangled. Rikki's missing clothes would eventually be found in a bin. Obviously, Ruth was already a suspect because her behavior was very well known to social services. She did abuse her children, and she blatantly just didn't care about them. And then she just refused to search for her son on the night she reports him missing. All seems a little suspicious to me. Police would also learn that Ruth was writing a book about a serial killer. Ruth would describe her book as, quote, a first-person account of the perfect murder about a fellow who strangles and mutilates a girl. On January 19th, 1995, Ruth was arrested and questioned over the murder of her son. 4 days later, she was charged with abusing her child. And then in May of 1995, she was charged with the murder of Rikki. So at Ruth's trial, quite a bit of information emerged. Apparently, at Ruth's house, officers recovered a picture of Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man inside a book. And obviously, they believe that Rikki was posed in the same manner. They also found a book called Magic, and it was written by a well-known occultist. And apparently, Ruth was very familiar with this book and practiced it. Apparently, the book spoke of sacrifice and the need to choose a victim, such as a male child of perfect innocence and high intelligence. So basically, the prosecution alleged that Ruth murdered her son by picking him up by his jacket and strangling him. And apparently she used this method on numerous occasions to punish him. Jurors would hear that apparently 10 days before the murder of her son, Ruth would tell social services that if they didn't take Rikki out of her home, that she was going to murder him. After 16 days, Ruth was actually found not guilty of murder. There just was no evidence to prove that she did it, but she was sentenced to 7 years for child abuse. And from that point forward, the case just went cold. That is, until 2015, when the case was reopened. And luckily, in February of 2016, police announced that they had a DNA match, and that means they had a suspect. And this would lead police right to Rikki's killer. And believe it or not, it wasn't Ruth. Instead, it was a man named James Watson. James Watson had actually been interviewed in the original investigation because witnesses had spotted James and Rikki together on the day of Rikki's murder. At the time when he was questioned, James basically told police that he had never been near Rikki, and apparently police didn't actually look deeply into this. They just figured, okay, We checked on the witness, and now we're going to focus our attention back on Ruth. They didn't really seem to want to focus on anybody but Ruth. And I understand that obviously she was the perfect suspect. She was a terrible mother. She was very abusive, but they should have followed this lead more closely. And then when James was brought in for questioning, he apparently changed this account. He basically said on the day that Rikki was murdered that he himself had gone to Well and Estate and was watching a digger when Rikki came up to him. And that was around 12:30 p.m. He stated, "Rikki said, 'That's a big tractor, isn't it?' I said, 'It's not a tractor, it's a digger.' I then moved away and asked the workmen what they were doing. Rikki was walking back towards Red Mile Walk." James would later change his statement again and say that basically while that happened, he picked Rikki up so that he could see through a hole in the fence, which would explain the DNA. And he said he basically just forgot that little detail. But police were actually able to determine that that fence hadn't been built yet. So James was effectively lying. James Watson was now a 40-year-old man who had quite a lengthy police history. He literally served 6 years in prison for firebombing a police station. When he was arrested for the murder of Rikki, he did make bail, and really he left the UK and went to Portugal. But he didn't even have a passport, so police had no idea how he managed to leave the country. And during the time he fled the UK, all he did was post pictures of himself on a beach, drinking alcohol, laying in the sun. Really, it just looks like he's enjoying a vacation. Apparently, he left the UK in a mobile home his friend was driving and helped hide him. So at the time of Rikki's murder, James Watson was a 13-year-old boy living in a group home. He was also regarded by social services as a vulnerable child. He couldn't stay at home because his father had been jailed, and his father was a police officer at one point. But allegations around James Watson started quite early. Around that time, he apparently touched a boy inappropriately, a 5-year-old boy who was friends with Rikki. He also pleased himself over images of children, and apparently during sex with teenage girls, he would try to strangle them. A manager of one of these children's homes that James Watson was staying in told jurors that she once found magazines under James Watson's bed of children and babies in their underwear. Teachers of James Watson would also go on to say the day after Rikki was murdered, James Watson actually photocopied the front page of the newspaper that had Rikki's story on it. There's also evidence that James Watson had killed a bird and put it in that star position, just as he had done after killing Rikki. During his trial, James Watson's own mother would actually testify. Apparently 3 days before the murder of Rikki, James had actually called his mother, and he told her of a supposed radio report about a child that was murdered, and this child was a 2-year-old, and he kind of went into detail, and he asked his mom if she heard about it. Shirley Watson would say, "I had a conversation by phone with my son, James Watson. James told me that a baby had been found over the dike near Well End. He wanted me to say if what he had heard was true. I told him that I had not heard this before and knew nothing of what was said." She said that they discussed the case for a few minutes more, and that was it. So perhaps James Watson was planning this murder all along. James Watson was found guilty and sentenced to at least a minimum of 15 years in prison. This case is kind of wild for a few reasons. There is some evidence that James Watson had been associated with the family prior to Rikki being murdered. Many people question if James Watson and Rikki's mother Ruth were in on the crime together. Honestly, everybody in Rikki's life failed him terribly. His mother, who was abusive and terrible, failed him. Social services, who saw the abuse, who knew it was happening, who heard Ruth say that she was going to kill her son, failed him. They could have removed him from his home, and he may still be alive today. The police who only focused on Ruth failed Rikki. Everyone in this child's life failed him miserably. At only the age of 13, James Watson murdered an innocent child. And I have no doubt that James Watson has hurt other people, even if it didn't end in murder. Although Rikki was only 6, he did his best to take care of his siblings. He very much made sure that they took baths and cleaned themselves. He very much liked to be clean. When his sisters were locked in their rooms and punished, he snuck them food to make sure they were eating. He just did his best as a little 6-year-old boy who was trying to survive. And everybody who did this child wrong should have been punished. I would love to know your guys' thoughts on this case. It really is quite an intense case if you do some research. Ruth Neave had a very turbulent childhood growing up, including stays in a mental health institute and things of that nature. But that's it for today, guys. If you like this video or any other video on my channel, be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss a video upload. If you have a suggestion for a case, pop in the comments below and I'll get to as many of them as possible. Check out some other videos on my channel while you wait, and I'll see you next time.